Close to the water. 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 Hello everybody.
Hi.
Thanks for coming today, whether you came by bus or I hope by boat. I hope there's a few people who arrived by boat, as there were plenty of boats on the water this morning. I'm going to start off this little performance from the water about the meaning and history and a whole load of things connected to this wonderful sport called rowing. You're at a rowing club, and I'll thank them at the end, but Doncaster Rowing Club made this possible. So where will I begin? I'm going to start with the feminist philosopher Elaine Scarry in the text called On Beauty and Being Just. It's more like a poem. The dip and drag of the oars, moving across the surface of the canvas, moving through the world and moving through the water like a rower in a weightless scull. So this sculling boat that I'm sitting in is basically a modern piece of technology, mainly carbon fibre. Take a little stroke, just to get a little bit away from pontoon. And you see what I'm doing? These are my brakes, but I'm actually doing something called holding. And if you put on the brakes hard, it's called hold hard. We'll come to that in a minute. So this piece of technology, this lightweight sculling boat, is incredibly fragile. If I let go of these oars, I will fall in the water. When I last did this performance live, done it a couple of times online, in Finland, a small girl, actually the daughter of a very good artist who also works on the water, called Antti Laitinen. The daughter was really upset because she saw the full 30-minute performance without me falling in. And that was on the River Ora in Turku, and it was done in high winds, very different conditions to how it is today. As you can see, the conditions are almost perfect here today. And it was done in high winds and seen from a floating bridge. So there's different parts of this boat, and the rowers have their own language for the way they describe their boats, the way they move in their boats, the way they interact with crews, the way they interact with other boats on the water. So either side of me we have my oars, or blades as we call them, and here I'm holding the handles with, as you see, with my thumbs pushing them out. And either side of me, just going to adjust a little bit. Either side of me, you have what are called the riggers. And when I take a stroke, as I'm going to now, there are sort of mainly four parts of it. So there's the catch, the swing, and the finish, three parts. I think I've missed a part out. I'm just going to do what they call in rowing circles backing down, so I can get a bit closer back to you and I don't hit the other bank. And when you're on the water, if you've been here earlier, you'd have seen quite a lot of boats on this rather narrow stretch but beautiful stretch of the River Don. And one of the things you learn when you learn to row is you learn to shout. like I am. And the reason you have to learn to shout, when I first joined a rowing club, we had to stand on the steps like you are sitting there and learn that shouting is not impolite. So you stand there, and if you're in a boat and a boat's coming towards you, you shout, "Have a look, sculler!" or "Have a look, double!" or "Have a look, 8!" or "Have a look, quad!" So if for those of you who were here on Thursday, the performance by Ingrid Pollard, she actually showed a rowing quad in a video and did a live performance where she actually shouted out the commands. So we'll come to Ingrid later, but Ingrid Pollard is a quite well-known photographer who's been nominated for the Turner Prize. But I discovered through a Facebook group that I run called Wild Rowing that she's actually known as Ingy Pingy, and as her social media handle, and she's also a rower, which she keeps very much to herself, but she's actually made a piece about rowing now. So this very light craft is also a kind of interesting symbol of accelerationist capitalism. They're really great boats, they go really fast, but you know, they're like our society, they're also very fragile and precarious. And I think we're seeing that after the pandemic now. Somebody described yesterday people's behaviour as being a bit like being in the roaring 20s after all the millions who had died in the First World War. After the pandemic, people are kind of letting go in a strange way. And of course we have this intense heat waves and climate. So I think it's an interesting symbol of accelerationism. Paul Virilio, another bit of philosophy, said the invention of the ship was also the invention of the shipwreck. So I think we have in history an interesting history of ships designed to go faster and faster, and how that drives commerce. So the tea clippers were designed before the age of steam, were designed to go faster and faster, and of course that then turned into the opium trade. And the opium trade was also the cause of the Opium Wars. So I'd just like to say a bit about my own background. My father is French Anglo-Indian, and he comes from a French enclave called Calicut. Now, he would have come over from France probably in the 18th century, rather his forebears, my great-great-great-great-grandfather, etc., would have come across. And the French actually fought with a man called Tipu Sultan, who was one of the crowned heads of Mysore. He was the Maharaja of Mysore. And they fought the East India Company for the right to trade in India. Getting a bit of a breeze here, which is nice. And so the British fought this guy, and Tipu Sultan had actually had a visit from some Chinese travellers, and the Chinese travellers had demonstrated fireworks and rocketry. So Tipu Sultan used the rocket against the British. Now, unfortunately for my forebears, the Tipu Sultan was killed in a famous battle, and the French were relegated to what they call the Comptoir Français, which are the various small enclaves where the French descendants now are, such as Pondicherry and Mahe and Calicut, where my father was born. But when they fired these rockets, when Tipu Sultan fired the rockets at the British were smart, and they brought a captured rocket back to England, and a man called Congreve built what was called the Congreve rocket, which is an early part of history of British rocketry. And the Congreve rocket was used back against the Chinese during the Opium Wars. So you can see how, just going to turn a bit, you can see how technology is a slippery thing and can be moved around for different reasons. So talking about, again, the technology that goes behind this boat, I want to talk about an artist who is a good friend of mine and was an Olympic sailor. His name is Charles Yadong Lim, and he represented, after he'd been an Olympic sailor, he became a visual artist and represented Singapore in the Venice Biennale. And he did an exhibition called Stealing the Trapeze. And this was based on a book that he found in his school library. Like many East Asians, he was sent off to an English public school, wealthy East Asians that is, and found this book in the library. And he also took up sailing at that school. And it was by Sir Peter Scott, a sailor, a very famous sailor of the time. And that claimed, in that book, he claimed to have invented the trapeze, which is this thing that's attached to a sailing boat to make it go faster. But in fact, the trapeze was invented by indigenous South Sea Islanders. So that artist then made an exhibition called Stealing the Trapeze, and the centerpiece was the book by Sir Peter Scott, which he had stolen from his school library just when he left. So, what am I sitting on? It's water, but it's rather clean. I actually went for a wild swim in this water 2 days ago on a little beach up there where I was waiting for you. And one of the reasons the river is clean is because of the activities of the Don Catchment River Trust, who, as you can see, have got a stall behind you. And every month they do a big clean-up. And so now this water is very, very clean. And of course, for us rowers, we're also very concerned about the quality of this water. But also, the history of this water is interesting because it's come a bit closer to you. As Phil Hay, the club's chairman, told me, the Don, like many other rivers in Europe, was named after the water goddess Danae, and the Danube and the River Don in Russia were also named after the water goddess Danae, the origin of the River Don, and presumably the origin of Doncaster itself. Excuse me a minute while I come towards you. I'm very bad at blacking down with both blades. It's the one thing I never really learned to do very well. So, in 886, on Christmas Day, the Anglo-Saxons defeated the Viking, Ivar the Boneless, who had captured Doncaster. And in the Battle of Doncaster, the Vikings were defeated. Now, the Vikings are interesting. In another part of my lecture that I would do in Scandinavia, I talk a lot about the Viking longboats, because little known thing, most of us, when we're children, we see these pictures of the Vikings with their helmets and the horns and these big boats with lots of rowers. But actually, Viking is a verb. The Viking, it comes from the tribes that used to go Viking. So Viking was actually pillaging and robbing and terrorizing villages. That's what Vikings were, and that's what Viking was. So one of the interesting things about that, the tradition that came from that, and again this was referenced in my last performance, is church boat racing. So church boat racing is very common in Norway and Sweden, and basically it comes from the tradition of entire villages getting into large boats to go to church. They're very religious communities, and interestingly enough, they now have, or they still have had, what they call church boat races. So the villagers would dress up in their Sunday best, a bit like how I'm dressed now, and they would row very solemnly to church, and then on the way back they would race. And they'd smear their boats with duck wax and oil and all sorts of things to make the boats go faster. And the villagers used to, you see, they had to have these boats to get the whole village to church, because not all villages had churches. And they used to hide their boats during the week so that other villagers couldn't see their boats, and design their boats to go faster. But there's another interesting connection with rowing and religion. There's a Episcopalian priest called Stacey Johnson, who is in the United States, which is the equivalent to the Unitarians that we have here in the Unitarian Church. Now, I'm not religious, but she thinks that there's a parallel to the fact that we row backwards, and we obviously have to take a look from time to time, but we row backwards but facing forwards. So she sees that as an article of faith, that we basically we have faith in the cocks to steer us in the right direction, and she sees it as a metaphor, a bit like Jesus walking on water. Okay, so why am I dressed like this? Why am I dressed like this? Well, there's a very interesting element of rowing that most people think that rowers are posh, and that's to do with the Oxford to Cambridge boat race, which, so I'm just going to have to, no, it's okay, Phil, thank you. I'll just get out a bit and come forward. So most people assume that rowers are posh, and in fact I've seen pictures of Oxbridge rowing eights dressed in full evening gear in their boats. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Good. So until the 50s, rowing was divided into two kinds of sports, a bit like rugby league and rugby union. And there were the professional rowers, which descended from the Thames Watermen and their clubs that continued. And as late as the early 60s, those professional rowers were not allowed to row against the Oxbridge rowers. But now that is extraordinary, because basically many of those rowing clubs came, like the one I trained in, which was Putney Town Rowing Club, came from the Watermen's clubs. And back in the old days, an actor called Thomas Doggett used the Thames Watermen. Now the Thames Watermen were kind of like a high-speed taxi service. Henry VIII used them to get from Hampton Court to London, and Thomas Doggett used the Thames Watermen to get him to his theatre performances in time, and that led to a race which goes on to this day called Doggett's Coat and Badge. Now, the other preconception about rowing is that everybody has to be young and lithe and dressed in lycra. It's a bit like, you know, cycling, racing cyclists, but that's not the case. I had a great moment when I first looked at the website of Doncaster Rowing Club, and I saw that on their front page they had a picture of mature rowers. So rowing, if any of you there are interested in rowing, joining the club, doing a learn to row course, the man in the hat there is Phil Haig, and he will introduce you to the learn to row course. But the other thing about rowing is that it's also become a lot more diverse. I mean, basically older people are encouraged, people of colour, people with disabilities, all kinds of people are encouraged to row. That wasn't the case in the 90s when I started to learn to row, and also when Ingrid Pollard started to learn to row. We both tried, we didn't know this at the time, but we didn't know each other at the time, we both tried to enrol in a certain East End of London rowing club, which I will not name. And that club was so racist that she decided not to pursue her membership there, instead join a club up in Hertfordshire. And I was also could never get out in a boat because they didn't like older rowers. I started when I was 45 and I'm 71 now. So I'd like to sort of thank a few people who've inspired me on this journey. to do close to the water. One is Buckminster Fuller, the artist and inventor, who used to row. He was a sculler, and he used to row from Vancouver Island to his architectural practice in the city of Vancouver in a sculling boat. But he was very worried about what would happen if he fell in, because it's actually really difficult to get into these boats if you fall in. If I were to fall in now, the thing to do would be I would grab hold of the boat and I would swim the boat towards the shore. But getting in is very difficult. There are lake rowers who do train to get in, but it's a very difficult thing to do. So Buckminster Fuller patented, it's in the US Patent Office, an invention called rowing needles, which is basically a light boat like this, but with floats either side, so you couldn't actually capsize. So here's one inspiration. Another inspiration in these times of Brexit is something called Rowing for Europe, which is a young Turkish and young Austrian who rowed the entire length of the Danube, remember, named after the water goddess Dana. And also the Indian teacher J.K. Ukashukamaran, who rows every day in Kerala to teach underprivileged children. And finally Ingrid Pollard, who joined my Wild Rowing Facebook group, and it basically encouraged me to carry on trying to make the connections between art and rowing. And finally, thanks very much to Phil and Carol of Doncaster Rowing Club for being so patient, getting me out on the water and give me a chance to perform close to the water for you today. So I'm going to close by doing what they call a piece, and I'm going to use a term used by coxes to encourage their crews. Let the boat sing! Right, that's a bad stroke. Again, back stop. Straighten up. Let the boat sing! Thank you very much.